Hi everyone, my name is Justin Haley. I'm the Communications Advisor for Paganel. I'll be moderating today's session. Later on in the call, I'm going to be asking a few commonly asked questions by people who are applying for licensure and want to know more about the competency-based assessment. So you'll hear me later do that, and our presenters today will answer those questions. In the meantime, our presenters today are Mark Fewer, the Chief Operating Officer and Deputy Registrar for Paganel, and also Heather Appleby, the Special Projects Manager for Paganel. I'd like to now pass it over to Mark Fewer so he can start the presentation.
Great, thanks Justin. Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us to learn more about the competency-based assessment framework for professional licensure, including what this framework means for you as an engineer in training or a geoscientist in training and how the system works. As Justin already mentioned, my name is Mark Fewer and I am the Chief Operating Officer, excuse me, and Deputy Registrar of Paganel. And I'm joined today, as Justin mentioned, by Heather Appleby, PEng, Paganel's Special Project Manager on the implementation of the competency-based assessment framework. So Heather's been working on our transition plan with respect to CBA, including timeline and actions, and the development of our guidelines and processes around CBA. A little later in our presentation, Heather will provide an overview of how the system works and will share further details on the expectations of the applicant as they work towards their PEng or PGO license. Next slide, please. We'll begin today's session by providing information about our current experience assessment process, followed by an overview of the competency-based assessment framework, or as we refer to it, CBA for short, why Paganel is adopting this framework, and the general process of evaluating applicants for professional licensure under this new model. From there, we'll focus on the requirements of applicants and how EITs and GITs like you can apply for PEng or PGO licensure using the CBA process. And finally, we'll discuss our timeline and process for implementing CBA. So let's begin with a review of the registration requirements for professional licensure and our current experience assessment processes. There are 5 primary requirements for professional licensure: acceptable academics, acceptable experience, proficiency in English, good character, and successful completion of the professional practice and ethics exam. The evaluation of experience is one component of the overall licensure process. The new CBA framework will also be one element of the overall licensure process. It will not replace the requirement for acceptable academic qualifications, language, character, or demonstration of professionalism and ethics. What it will replace is the way that we currently evaluate the experience requirement. At present, we evaluate experience through our use of the Satisfactory Engineering and Geoscience Work Experience Framework and through provision of professional references. The current system is a paper-based system focused primarily on the type and quantity of experience that an applicant has, and it relies heavily on the judgment of an applicant's professional references. The Satisfactory Experience form is used in conjunction with our current internship guideline and requires an applicant to provide examples of their work throughout their career to date, illustrating how they've met the satisfactory work experience elements as described under that guideline. The information provided by the applicant is then shared with the applicant's references for comment, along with a reference form that solicits information about the applicant's performance and character. The applicant is also required to provide a current detailed CV or resume and a logbook if one was kept. Altogether then, this information is provided to the registration committee for evaluation. The decision on whether the applicant has met the experience requirement overall is then communicated to the applicant at the end of the process. So that's a brief summary of the way that we currently evaluate the experience requirement for licensure. Now let's move on to an overview of CBA. There's movement happening globally, not just among engineering and geoscience regulators, but regulators of many different professions towards competency-based evaluations for licensure. Such evaluations are focused on outputs, a demonstration of understanding and abilities versus inputs, what and how much of something has been acquired. Paganel has adopted the CBA model to ensure that applicants can demonstrate a cohesive professional preparedness prior to receiving an independent right to practice professionally. Competency-based evaluations are being implemented nationally. That helps ensure a fair, transparent, and standard approach to recognizing applicant ability. The CBA provides a model for reviewing the abilities and demonstrated skills and experience of individuals who have applied to be licensed engineers or geoscientists. The system involves a multi-step review process where applicants demonstrate competencies in professional and technical categories. Using an online system, applicants describe actions and outcomes related to the specific required competencies, which, following a self-assessment, will be reviewed and rated by a reference or references known as validators. Once the applicant has completed the self-assessment for all categories and the validators have completed their evaluation of same, 2 independent third-party assessors will review the information submitted by both the applicant and the validator to determine if the competencies have been met. Altogether then, this information will be subsequently reviewed by Paganel in helping determine if the applicant is prepared for professional licensure. This chart gives you a brief overview of our CBA process. It starts with the information provided by you, the applicant, which is reviewed, confirmed, and rated by the validators as identified by you, the applicant, and then handed to 2 third-party assessors for adjudication before being presented to the registration committee for a final decision. So why have we chosen to move to this CBA model? Well, as mentioned earlier, competency-based evaluations are focused on outputs, a demonstration of one's abilities, versus inputs, what and how much of something has been acquired. It's strongly believed that an outputs-based evaluation has the greater impact in terms of public protection. That's why many regulated professions globally have made this transition. The same is happening across Canada, and in particular among our fellow engineering and geoscience regulators. This effort's being coordinated by Engineers Canada and Geoscientists Canada, our national bodies. A nationally recognized program helps ensure consistency among provincial and territorial jurisdictions when adjudicating applicants for licensure. A unified, consistent approach ensures we're evaluating applicants for licensure using the same approaches and standards. CBA also increases the objectivity and transparency of the registration process. The framework helps avoid arbitrary decisions and processes while providing the applicant with clear information as to the judgment of their competencies. Heather will offer further insight on these points a little bit later in our presentation. The online CBA system is also easy to use, accessible from anywhere, and enables an applicant to log their experience and keep track of their progress in real time. Our current system, while still a valid standard, is not as clear, transparent, or as user-friendly as the CBA framework, and also does not allow for as much detail and feedback from supervisors and validators. Next, we're going to take a look at the CBA model in more detail, including the role of the applicant. I'll now turn things over to Heather Appleby, our Special Projects Manager.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Justin. The first step involved in competency-based assessment is for an applicant like yourself to complete an online self-assessment. You would rate yourself on a scale of 0 to 5 in a number of competencies, 34 for engineering and 29 for geoscience, in a handful of categories specific to your practice. You would also provide examples for each competency to support self-evaluation and will complete an employment history with chronology and task details. We'll touch on what those examples look like later. You would also be free to include any supporting documentation you feel is important to your assessment. This may include a thesis abstract or a CV for a non-PEng PGEO supervisor. Next slide, please. The application is then moved on to a validator. A validator is a reference chosen by an applicant to review the self-assessment by the applicant and provide comments and amendments to same. You would assign a validator to each competency. They must have first-hand knowledge of the work. The validators will also answer questions provided to act as a reference for you and comment on your ability to independently practice. 4 validators are required per applicant, with at least 2 needing to be a professional engineer, professional geoscientist, or similar. For any validators who are not licensed professionals, the applicant must provide a CV so their experience can be evaluated to see if they are an acceptable validator. If an applicant is having issues getting 4, they are able to contact PEG&L for further assistance. Typically, validators are supervisors, but they can also be clients or colleagues. Validators who are not assigned to competencies only provide overall feedback. Applicants will not see validator feedback unless the validator chooses to share it with them. Assessors evaluate the information shared in relation to the competency examples provided by the applicant and determine if that competency has both been reasonably demonstrated according to their assessment of the applicants and validators provided information, and if that example results in the score level as submitted by the applicant. Each file will have at least 2 independent assessors. This is to ensure fairness and transparency in the process. If the 2 assessors agree on the evaluation, an applicant can reasonably feel that they have received a consistent evaluation. If the 2 assessors have a differing opinion on the applicant's demonstration of competencies, a 3rd assessor may be brought in to reevaluate to ensure the applicant receives a reasonable judgment. The assessments of the applications will be shared with the registration committee, who will use them in evaluating the overall competency of the applicant. Assessors are bound by a confidentiality agreement similar to that which the registration committee adheres to. Assessors are aware of the names, education, and limited employment history of applicants. If an assessor feels based on that information that they have a conflict of interest, they are asked to declare it. The assessor is anonymous to the applicant, and the assessor also doesn't know what other assessor is co-reviewing. The competency categories for engineering applicants and their number of competencies included in each are technical competence with 10 competencies, communication with 3, project and financial management with 5, team effectiveness with 2, professional accountability with 6, social, economic, environmental, and sustainability with 5, and personal continuing professional development with 3 competencies. It should be noted that each competency includes examples of what will satisfy the competency, which are otherwise known as indicators. The competency categories for geoscience applicants are professionalism with 7 competencies, scientific with 5, area of geoscience practice with 7, and complementary with 10. For geoscience, each competency has workplace examples to provide guidance on how a competency can be met. The format which you would use to demonstrate competencies is as follows. Situation. An applicant like yourself will provide a brief overview of a specific situation or problem that relates to the competency that is being assessed. There are character maximums, so to avoid the applications being too long or unwieldy. In the case of the situation, the limit is 300 characters. Action. From there, you would note the action taken or task performed in response to the situation, including engineering or geoscience judgments made or solutions found. The action should relate to both the situation identified and the competency being assessed. This has a 1200 character limit. Outcome. Finally, you would note the outcome, which is the impact your actions, solutions, or judgments generated. That outcome helps to formulate the score that is assigned to you as a demonstration of the competency. This also has a 300 character limit. When completing competencies, applicants are advised to be specific, use point form where possible, speak in the first person, and provide the best examples of their experience. So this is a screen capture of a competency that you would complete. It lists the competency to be demonstrated, potential workplace examples, and has fillable fields regarding your employer, title, validator, dates, and the situation that will be evaluated. We will cover these a little more in our demo later in the presentation. Regarding the scoring of competencies, you would rate each of the competencies on a scale of 0 to 5. Your validators also review these ratings and provide their own based on their impression of you in each area. While the competencies and categories have more specific parameters regarding assigning a score, generally the values are used in the following ways. A score of 0 means you have had no exposure to this particular competency. We will get into the expected ratings for competencies in order for an applicant to be considered proficient enough for licensure, but generally speaking, we expect that someone who is applying for licensure would have had at least minimal exposure to each of the competencies. A score of 0 will prevent an applicant from becoming licensed without them taking on further action or tasks. Not to worry, it is generally unlikely you would have no exposure to most competencies, and if not, there are generally accessible remedies to get beyond that level. A score of 1 is awareness training level. This score means that you have been introduced to the competency, but don't have much considerable experience or actions outside of base knowledge or exposure. A score of 2 means that you have moved past being merely exposed or aware of the competency and have begun to become immersed in knowing and understanding the competency in a meaningful way. A score of 3, which as you will learn shortly is a fairly critical score when it comes to licensure, is generally used by you or your validators when you or they feel you have reached a moderate level of knowledge and ability to the degree where you are ready to assume responsibilities on your own with a moderate level of supervision. This score should be used when you feel generally comfortable with a competency, while simultaneously understanding your limitations or recognizing when you may require consultation from another professional or manager. Applicants who self-assess a competency at a level of 4 feel confident they have reached professional proficiency in that area. This means you feel prepared and able to handle situations in that area without having to consult others or be otherwise managed in relation to the tasks relating to same. Finally, level 5 is a mature professional level of competency. Essentially, you would consider yourself an expert in this area. It is possible for applicants or validators to correctly assess an individual at a score of 5. However, these would largely be cases where an international applicant is applying for licensure in Canada for the first time, or an individual has notable employment experience in an area relating to the core competencies prior to beginning to obtain their post-educational experience. 5s will be very rare. It is very important that you rate yourself fairly and honestly when evaluating your competencies. So, how do we determine, based on the scored system, whether an applicant is suitable for licensure? Applicants require an average minimum score in each competency category in order to be deemed suitable for licensure. This is to ensure that you are comfortable and experienced enough to reasonably work in the profession you are applying to be licensed in. You'll note that many of the average score requirements is 3 or an approaching a professional level. As it is an average, you do not need to demonstrate the minimum level in each of the competencies in each category. By achieving the average in each category, you are acknowledged as having suitable understanding without being overly prohibited. As mentioned earlier, however, a score of 0 in a competency will lead one to be asked to perform subsequent actions that will give them enough awareness to be ranked a 1. So we will now take you to the CBA website to give you a quick snapshot on how the system works and what you as an applicant will be doing as part of the process. All right, I'm going to start with the Paganel website. If we go under application forms, the application forms have been updated to reflect the transition to CBA. So this is the form you would use when you're applying for licensure. And you can also access more information on CBA here. So this gives an overview of competency-based assessment. It includes a link to the Competency Assessment Manual, which is the main governing document for competency assessment here at Paganel, and is a very useful resource. The engineering indicators are also available here, as well as the geoscience workplace examples. Some adoption information is available, And there's also a link to the competency assessment system. Okay, that'll take you to competencyassessment.ca. So you can log in here. You would select Paganel as your jurisdiction. Log in. When you go to create an account, you would just click on create an account down here. Right, and so this is the welcome page. So this is where you access everything. So my account will just give you generic information about your account. Your registration ID will be your Paganel member number. You can also change your password or change your email here. There's also a My Courses section. The system has applicant tutorial courses that are available based on either if you're an engineering applicant or a geoscience applicant. So they can be accessed from here. Then you go to resume self-assessment. This test account has engineering and a geoscience assessment. Normally you would only have one available to you. First, we'll go into the engineering assessment. This one has been completed and submitted. So after your self-assessment has been completed, you can still go in and view the information, but you're not able to make any changes. So you'd have education information. This is entered by Paganel based on your educational information you provided when you became an EIT or GIT. So your employment history, a listing of your validators, any supporting documents, and then this is the competency assessment yourself, and we can see that this has been submitted. We can also see that the self-assessment has been submitted and the validator assessment is also complete. Just to show you engineering competence, we can go in here. You can see it. So this defines the competency to be demonstrated. So this competency is intended to demonstrate your knowledge and awareness of Canadian regulations, codes, and standards. This includes local engineering procedures and practices as applicable. We can see there's additional guidance here. There's also help that defines competencies are. You can see here that there are indicators. So this gives you guidance on examples you can use to meet this competency. And for the engineering technical competencies, there are some discipline-specific indicators. You can see here, this has been selected as project and construction management. There are also generic indicators that anyone can use. You do not have to use the discipline-specific ones. So we can see that there's also the employer information, your position, the validator, start and dates, then a brief description of the situation, list your action. You can see that it reminds you to be specific about your individual work and contributions, and use of the word I is recommended, and point form is encouraged. Then you can see a brief outcome, mark whether or not this example was in the Canadian environment, and then you can see the self-assessed competence level, which in this case was a 4. And the applicant is unable to see the validator or assessor feedback. Now I'll go to the geoscience one. This one is still in progress. So again, you have the education information. So if there are any errors or if you have a graduate degree you'd like to add to this, you would have to contact Paganel to get that added to your competency self-assessment. Move on to employment history. So if we go to add employment history, we can choose work experience, thesis, or other. If you select thesis, you will have to supply your thesis abstract in the supporting documentation portion. If we go into work experience, you would list your employer, the location, start date, and end date if applicable, your job title, primary area of practice, list your supervisor, and you'd have to give a brief overview of major responsibilities and projects for the position. So this is basically a resume builder that will help us to evaluate if you've met the 48-month experience requirement. Move on to validators. So we can see here that only 3 validators have been listed. The minimum recommended number is 4. So if we want to add a validator, you have to supply the name and email as well as the designation. And if a validator isn't a licensed PEng or PGO, you would have to supply their CV. In the next section here in the supporting documents, you would upload CVs. This is also where you'd have your thesis abstract, if applicable, and any other supporting documentation you want to provide. Supporting documents are not required except for thesis abstracts and CVs for non-PEng, non-PGO validators. Then we go into the competency self-assessment. So we can see there's some information. There's the engineering competency assessment guide and the geoscience competency assessment guide. This is what PEG&L's competency assessment manual is based on. But the PEG&L document also has some important information specific to PEG&L and our registration process. So it is important to review that one as well. So we can see here, so this one, we can see this has been submitted and the validator assessment has been completed. So we can't make any changes, or well, I'm sorry, we can change this until we've submitted the full competency assessment, but if you do, it will have to be validated again. So we can see here that there's a competency to be demonstrated is given. So it's comply with relevant legislation, regulations, and statutory reporting requirements. Workplace examples are provided. So examples you could use to meet this competency may include apply for licenses and permits, undertake stakeholder consultations, or complete and file reports and notifications. So then you would select your employer. This would be from is a drop-down list generated from your employment history. You would list your position, give your validator, which again, you select from the drop-down list, give the dates for this example, then you would list your situation, you would have your action, and then you give your outcome, select your whether or not it's a Canadian example, and then you would define your self-assessed competence level. And if you click here, this gives you a reminder of what the different levels are. And we can see up here that the required overall level for this category is 3. So now we can see here that the validator has requested a revision in this competency. So if we go in, review the information, similar to the other one, and then when we go down, we can see that there is a validator's feedback to applicant. So this is saying, please provide more detail, because of course, this example is not acceptable. And we can see here that this one, the validation is pending. So we're still waiting for the validator to respond. So this is very nice. You can keep track of whether or not your validators have completed their validation, which is very useful moving forward. And if we want to go into a new one, so this one is blank. So again, it's the same information. So you just fill it out. You can save it as a draft, save it as complete. And then at the end of the day, when you have them all done, you click submit complete self-assessment, and then PEG&L will be notified, and PEG&L will be notified when your validation is complete, and we will then assign assessors, and it will go to the registration committee. And we can see here that one validator hasn't been selected to validate any competencies, so they will just be asked to provide overall feedback on your readiness for professional licensure. And up here, there's also a view PDF report option. So if we click on that, we'll get this generates a PDF report of your competency assessment or the completed portions. So if you have completed a couple of competencies, but you want to discuss them with one of your validators, you can generate this PDF file, and then you can use that to get some feedback from your validators if you so choose. All right, so Justin, I will hand it back over to you now to return to the slide deck. Thank you. So, as mentioned earlier, we are aiming to have the CBA system fully implemented later this year. Thank you. So our first information session was held on February 11th for potential assessors. It's necessary to ensure that we have the appropriate number and type of assessors before proceeding to have applicants use the system. The assessors have undergone training. The training is largely done individually online, as the CBA system has an in-depth training module. The assessors have also been presented demo applications for practice purposes. In March, we held an information session for senior members in training who are approaching readiness for licensure to invite them to become a part of a pilot project. Our goal was to have a meaningful number of applicants volunteer to use this system early so that we have some real-time local examples logged before making the system mandatory for all new applicants later this year. In May, we presented the practice assessments to the registration committee for review to enable the committee to see the process in action. Today, of course, we are providing an information session to you, our current members in training. This month, we will also use general and targeted communications, noting that CBA will be fully implemented by September 1st, 2021. Any existing EITs and GITs with less than 2 years of post-graduation experience must start using CBA by that date. Likewise, any new applications received from those who are not currently members in training with PEG&L after this date will be required to use the CBA framework. Next slide, please. Thank you. Competency-based assessment comes into effect in Newfoundland and Labrador on September 1st, 2021. Applicants for professional licensure who apply on or after that date must use the competency-based assessment system. Similarly, members in training registered with PEG&L on or after September 1st, 2019 must use the competency-based assessment system. If you were registered as an MIT before September 1st, 2019, you will have the option to apply using the current experience review process. In other words, following the internship guideline and using the satisfactory work experience elements form as described earlier, or using the new CBA framework. This option will remain in place until September 1st of next year, 2022. If you have not filed an application for professional licensure by that date, you will be required to use the CBA framework at that point. However, you are encouraged and invited to switch to competency-based assessment as early as possible. PEG&L will be communicating with all current MITs on these changes this week and will provide instructions on how to create a competency assessment account. This communication will also include a link to the competency assessment manual. This document contains important information on competency-based assessment and the PEG&L registration process and should be reviewed carefully. Once you receive this communication, we encourage you to create your competency assessment account and begin work on your competency self-assessment. Under the old system, you would have kept a logbook throughout your MIT period. Similarly, you should record your employment history and work on your competency self-assessment throughout this period. This will also give you an opportunity to identify areas where you need to improve your competency before you are ready to apply for licensure. That's everything I had today. So are there any questions?
Thank you, Mark and Heather. So as I mentioned earlier in the call, I will be asking some frequently asked questions that normally come up with applicants and potential applicants about the CBA system. So the first one, you spoke about validators earlier, and you touched on this a little bit, but we'll ask it regardless. Do all of your validators need to be professional engineers and geoscientists? And if someone works with PTEX, can they also serve as validators?
Okay, so ideally, all of your validators would be professional engineers or professional geoscientists, but we know that may not be the case. So you can use non-PNG Geo as validators, including PTEX, but you would have to supply a CV for them so that the assessors and registration committee can evaluate their experience and make sure that they are qualified to serve as a validator. As well, it's recommended that you have a minimum of 2 professional engineers or geoscientists serve as your validators.
Excellent. How about the logbook? What does one do with their logbook?
So competency-based assessment replaces the logbook. So if you have been keeping your logbook up to date, I think you'll find that will be a very useful tool in helping you to complete your competency self-assessment, but it does not need to be submitted.
All right, next question. How long does the application process typically take?
So once you've completed your self-assessment, the validation portion really depends on your validators, but as I showed in the demonstration, you can keep track of that. You can see whether or not they've responded. So you can follow up with your validators as needed to complete that. Once the validation is completed, assessors typically get 3 to 4 weeks to complete their assessment, and then it has to go to the registration committee for their review. So you can expect your application to take at least 8 weeks to be processed after validation is completed.
Great. What does one do if their direct supervisor is not a PNG or PGO?
Mark, I'll let you take that one. Sure, no problem, Heather. It's a question, I guess, that comes up a fair bit, actually. If you find yourself in a situation where you're not being supervised by a PNG or PGO, as Heather already mentioned, of course, it's still possible that your supervisor could serve as a validator. And as she mentioned, the registration committee would need to look at that person's qualifications to determine if they're suitable to provide an opinion on your experience. It's also, of course, possible for you to identify validators who are licensed professionals, but maybe who weren't your supervisor, such as colleagues or clients. Regardless, I guess, though, of those scenarios, if you do find yourself in a situation where you're not being directly supervised by a professional engineer or professional geoscientist, it will be best if you contact Paganel to let us know. We do have a mentorship program that will help ensure applicants are able to have their competencies appropriately validated in a situation where they're not working under the supervision of an engineer or geoscientist, and the applicant has the option to identify a professional with whom they could be paired with under that arrangement, or we can assist the applicant in finding someone.
Great, thank you, Mark. Does an applicant need to spread out their examples from all 4 years of their work experience?
No, they do not. Generally, for your competencies, you're advised to use your best examples. And so in many cases, those are probably more recent examples. Your employment history does need to cover your 4 years of experience. So your employment history should cover the full 48 months or more of experience that you have, but your competencies do not have to cover the same period.
Excellent, thank you, Heather. That concludes the most commonly asked questions regarding competency-based assessment. If you do have any further questions or they haven't been answered today, once again, there is information available on www.paganel.ca with more information. And Heather, perhaps you'd like to share how they can further contact us if should they not be able to answer their question through the website?
Well, my first recommendation would be to review the competency assessment manual. There is a FAQ section in that. And one of the questions in that is, if the manual doesn't answer your question, there is contact information in there.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone. We'd like to thank you for taking the time to watch this session today, and we hope you found it informative and useful regarding the competency-based assessment. Take care.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone. Bye-bye.